Hi, Liam Hennessy here, Academic Director at Setanta College, and I'm delighted to speak today about the role that performance science now plays, not just in sport, but increasingly within exercise and health. Today we're joined by a very special guest in Jason Cowman, strength and conditioning coach to the Grand Slam winning Irish Rugby team this year, and with whom we will talk about his journey as an S&C coach within Irish Rugby. This will be an informal conversation and will describe how and why he became an S&C coach back in the late 1990s, would you believe, and what changes have marked his long influential career. These changes will address how players now prepare for the game versus how they used to, and how both technology but also the softer relationship skills still now play key roles. However, where better to start a conversation about the art, craft and science of coaching than with a coach who has overseen the S&C and performance development programs of one of the most successful Irish rugby sides of all time. I am delighted to be joined by Jason Cowman, so let's get our live chat underway. You're very welcome here to our sound studio here at Setanta College, where I'm delighted to be joined by Jason Cowman, fitness coach, strength and conditioning coach with the Irish national rugby team, and very shortly he will be whizzing his way back up to Dublin to start the camp period to prepare Ireland, the Irish rugby players team, for their journey down under in the next few weeks. Joe, you're very, very welcome to Thurles.
Thank you.
We've been having a conversation already here, and Jason has mentioned and he's described how he got involved in this whole area, and I'd like him just to maybe go back to that a little bit again and just explain what brought you into this whole area of fitness, strength and conditioning back in the late 90s.
Yeah, well, I was always interested in it, as most young kids were through teenage years, growing up in terms of sport and activity. Played Gaelic football and soccer. I really enjoyed it, and sport and exercise science was a new degree that came out in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and it was something that I looked at and was interested in. But at the time, because it was so new, I don't think my parents or my career guidance teacher were, overly supportive of going down to Limerick and starting the course, but simply because of the fear of not knowing what the course was going to give you at the end of it. So I didn't go down to Limerick to do the sports science course, and I went to UCD for a year and did a course there, which I didn't like so much. And halfway through that year, I remember going back to my parents saying, I want to go down and do the sports science course. And thankfully, at that point in time, they saw the determination, or they saw the sort of lack of motivation in the course that I was doing, and happily they agreed. But looking back on it, I think the reason why I was interested in doing it was just the enjoyment factor behind sport. It brought something out in me that I liked, and that I felt energized by, and that I thought I had a kind of a strength toward. So I guess the overriding principle, which is everybody would acknowledge, is if it's something that, and it's not so much following your passion, but if it's something that brings a passion out in you, then it's something I think that you should pursue. And sport, exercise, health, in a team environment certainly brought a passion out in me that I needed to listen to.
Okay, I remember the day that we sat and interviewed for the role as Leinster fitness coach.
Advisor.
Leinster fitness advisor, Jason, probably 1990. 98, 99. Yeah. So you're one of that group of elite or select strength and conditioning coaches, if we may say now, who have had a career of 20 years in the same environment. And so you've been privileged, and the players have been privileged to come through, for example, from their teens right through to retirement now at this stage. And that's been an interesting journey, I've no doubt. But could you take us through what it was like then for you, and the development of the emphasis in terms of fitness and whatever, up to where we are now?
Yeah, okay. Well, over the 20-year span, it's kind of everything has changed and nothing has changed in some respects. When we started out back in those early 2000s, rugby in 96 I think went professional. So there was a bunch of people in Leinster and across the other provinces trying to figure out what it meant to be professional, having been sort of in an amateur environment prior to that. So very quickly we sort of did a needs analysis in terms of how Irish rugby compared to the other nations. And probably if you cast your mind back at that time, the Irish rugby team, provincial teams probably weren't fit enough, in the sense that around the 60-minute mark, 65-minute marks, they began to fatigue, and oftentimes they would lose games in the last 15 minutes to everybody's frustration. So fitness and getting fit to last 80 minutes of rugby became sort of the first critical feature that we needed to get through, which we did. And then when you get fit enough, I guess the next question becomes, well, are we big enough to compete? So then you go and you try and get big enough and put some size on, and then you get your size, and then the next thing is, well, are we fast enough and are we strong enough? So then you look and you try and get your size or your strength and your speed up to where it needs to be, and you go through all of these kind of components of fitness and move through those areas of development to try and get to a point where you're happy with your physical characteristics and your physical profile to play. And we did all of those things, but I guess what we missed out on, maybe because of those external demands or the demands being placed on us, was that we missed out on what I consider to be the fundamental, which is movement, and our ability to move with efficiency, and move based on the demands of the environment that we find ourselves in. So when I say everything has changed and nothing has changed, we've changed our physical profile dramatically. We are now, I think, very, very much able to compete physically with teams. But the fundamental of moving and moving well and having good coordination and being able to read an environment and then get your body to react accordingly is a critical component part of any field sport.
So that has huge implications, yes, and I would imagine for the pathway that currently is there for the player who's maybe coming through from, let's say, schools, sub-academies through. How does your role, do you play a role in that, or what is your connection with that?
I think there is the links between the schools rugby, the academies across the provinces and into the professional upper echelons of rugby is strengthening for sure. And it's this club game as well obviously is very closely attached to that as well. And yes, there is a huge sort of drive to try and positively influence and to learn from what the schools and what the clubs are doing, so that we can maybe emphasize what we consider to be the fundamentals of physical development, so that when that player moves hopefully and shifts into an academy or a development contract, that they have already honed those fundamentals of movement skills, so that they can then begin to develop the strength, the size, the power that we think would help them in terms of their performance capabilities. But we still have a long way to go in that, and sometimes, as I said, those external demands of a game, those external demands of having to win, external demands of wanting the contract, can overpower those fundamentals, which again for me is back to movement, back to having that coordinated movement, that it's almost like that graceful ability to move on a pitch.
We spoke earlier then about I suppose your role and your approach in terms of what the significant skills are now. Okay, we could talk about the methods of training, we could talk about the technologies, and we'll do so in a while. But you mentioned something that's more fundamental than that. You mentioned about relationships and how central that is to what you do now.
It's critical. I think one of the lessons that I've sort of learned over the years, and everybody would acknowledge the significance and the importance of relationships, never mind sport. I mean, we all have this sort of sense, a sort of a need to belong, and the way in which you can belong is by having these positive relationships. And for me, I've spoken about this before, but for me the critical kind of characteristics that within relationships are that they need to be hopeful. They need to be generous and they need to be forgiving. So hopeful in the sense that it may be that I don't necessarily have a graw for you, or maybe that myself and yourself don't interact all that well, but I need to go into any kind of interaction I have with you in a hopeful way, that I need to get something out of that interaction such that we can move closer to the outcome that we both want. I think generous in the sense that oftentimes relationships aren't 50-50 splits. Sometimes those relationships are 60-40 or even 70-30, that I need to cede at times to the other person, the other partner in the relationship, so that we get to that point that we both need to go to. But I think if we demand all the time that it's a 50-50, it's an even split, and you can see this with children sometimes. If it's not fair that they got this and I didn't get that, if we push hard the whole time for that 50-50 split, sometimes that pie can be just destroyed. So it's really important to be able to have maneuverability in a relationship, so that I'll give you something this time, and next time maybe I'll get it back. And if we work in that kind of bandwidth, I think we've got a right good chance to develop a positive relationship that ends up being almost 50-50, and the pie doesn't get destroyed. And then the last one I think is forgiveness and forgiving. You know, we annoy people. I annoy people. We all irritate each other, and it's really important that you've got a process in your head, or that there's a process within the organisation where we can forgive and we can move forward together again to get to that ultimate sort of outcome that we both desire.
These are huge fundamental values and principles. I'm reminded of my good friend, the great AK, whose lovely statement was, methods are many, principles are few. Methods often and frequently change, but principles rarely do. So can I take it that underneath or underpinning all that you do in terms of your technical methods, everything, that those are the core, some of the core principles that guide you in how you do what you do?
Look, I'm not saying that I'm an incredible man when it comes to building relationships, but I acknowledge the value that they have in terms of creating a positive environment for work. I think the other principle for me outside of methodology is trying to examine the reason why you do what you do. And we talk to the playing group an awful lot about the intent behind our work. Why are you doing what you do? And they're it's an internal question in many respects. So I'd often say to them, understand why we're squatting in basic terms. Try and figure out the rationale behind the squat. It's to develop lower limb strength. That lower limb strength will allow you to be a little bit more effective in the contact or in the carry or in the game. But more so than that, what are the internal reasons for being the professional that you are? What is the intent behind your behavior? And for me, over the years, I remember battling, as we all would, with sort of control, wanting control, getting upset if I didn't have control, not enjoying that experience, and then realizing that that's just the intent behind what I'm doing is probably not the cleverest. And then it was almost like, okay, well, forget about control. You don't need necessarily to have control. But then I was sort of driven by looking for respect from my peers. And I don't think that's an unworthy sort of intent to have, but it creates a bit of pressure in terms of how you behave and how you perform. So driving yourself on to get respect from your peers may or may not be an advantage in terms of your intent. And now, and I'm a long time in it now, for me it's about growth. The intent behind what I do is in order to grow, and that just takes the pressure away, because I'm allowed to make mistakes, because making mistakes allows me to grow. I'm allowed to try things, because trying things allows me to grow. And I don't have the pressure of having to get respect from my peers, and I certainly don't have the pressure of needing or wanting control. So along with the values that drive you, I think the intent and examining the reason behind how you behave is critically important.
Very good and fascinating, Joe. I'm going to take you back onto a different wavelength now.
Okay.
Because you singularly with a leading GPS technology company, probably were the first to introduce GPS monitoring to team sport. Correct me if I'm wrong, it's well over 10 years now.
Yeah, I think
well over 10
I think
years.
2007, 2008,
Yeah.
we took it into Leinster, yeah.
That wasn't the first introduction of technology into the game, but how much of a role does such technologies now play in the management of the player and the management of the whole process, and in what your role is?
Yeah, it's very significant. If I bring you back to 08, 07, 08, if you remember, Leinster won the Heineken Cup for the first time in 2009, and the introduction of GPS and the beginnings of understanding the internal workings of a player, almost in terms of how they're reacting to a session or to a week's worth of training, was very significant in our ultimate success in 09. And I remember using it quite effectively with the coach at the time in terms of managing players' exposure, but also making sure that those players who didn't get an appropriate level of exposure got an exposure that was appropriate. So critically important. And then since then, data and data analysis and all of that has taken a massive role and taken up a large degree of space in professional organisations, and to really good effect. There's no question that the data that you get, the objective information, alongside the subjective information, alongside your intuitive thought, is a critical part of sort of good and effective decision making. But I guess what I would say is to warn against the overemphasis of data as well. We would all accept that data shouldn't lead; it should inform decision making, and we would all accept, I suppose, that if as a coach you want to affect change in a player, it may well come from data, but data won't be the only thing that helps you affect change in a player.
I sense, Joe, that this is part and parcel of a balance that you've been involved for over 20 years, and you've grown organically with technology. You've grown organically with building relationships, and as you mentioned earlier, striking a balance and understanding that you're part of a bigger picture. What suggestions or guidelines would you have for those who are hopeful, who are students, let's say now, our coaches, our students who study with us? What suggestions would you make to them in relation to balancing that dual requirement of relationship building, technology, data management, and the whole support of the player? And we'll come to the coach later, but the whole support of the player first of all.
I think maybe as soon as you can in your career, engage in kind of self-reflective processes. Examine again the reason behind what you're doing. Be your own, and I don't mean your own worst critic, but self-reflect. Be able to critically assess, the rationale behind the decisions that you made, and see whether or not those decisions ended up being productive ones. Not necessarily right or wrong ones, but were they productive ones? If we can get engaged in that process, I think as a coach, your learning will probably be accelerated. Don't be afraid to rely on people's feedback as long as those people have your best interests at heart. People like yourself, people like AK, people like mentors, peers, they can all accelerate your learning as well. And ultimately, I would say, try and just put yourself in a position whereby you can grow, a position whereby you're not attached to dogma, you're not narrow-minded, you're open to experiences, you're open to the views of other people, and try and put yourself in a position whereby you can grow.
I think what students and coaches listening may not appreciate is that you were probably as well one of the first to adopt the principle of readiness to train and the assessment of that. And again, the Kitman Labs is probably you would be the brains behind that whole process. And is that still okay? It's now very current.
Yeah.
But is that still a relationship, technology, data, a system, or is it, as often people think about it, it's just gathering the metrics on the morning of a training session or on the morning of a match and letting them lead you as to your decision? So wherein now are you with the concept of gaining metrics, readiness to train, etc.?
Yeah, well, look, I think the first thing there was more than my brain behind the development of Kitman Labs for sure. But thankfully, that's an Irish success story, and we want as many of them as we can. We would combine absolutely in terms of our readiness protocols. We would combine the objective assessment of where a player, of what a player's state is, alongside the sort of subjective feedback from the player, and also our own subjective view as to what is required. So we absolutely use the data. We assess the data based on sort of standard deviations above or below, quite simply. But if we feel that there's an elevated level of risk to a player, and if that level of risk is observed in maybe 3 or 4 objective measures, then there's absolutely a process in place by which we manage that player. And it might be a management of just trying to increase their recovery protocols. It might be the management of a reduction in training load or intensity in the gym. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is manage that player so that they can perform optimally when they train. Our first port of call is not to take them from training. It's to try and manage however much training we do with them, but get them to commit fully to that amount of training. And oftentimes we don't need to go to a rugby coach to talk to them about it. The player can do it, or the backroom staff, medical team, physios, S&C coaches can manage that adjustment for sure. So the data becomes a critical part of that. But having said that, if the player isn't engaged in the process, well then all your data, it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. So we would set aside a 30-minute window following a team meeting for the players to get ready to train. As well as, and prior to that meeting, we would have actioned any events that we need to action from our data. But that 30 minutes is critically important. But the player needs to commit fully to that 30 minutes, as well as us having the framework around which we expect them to operate within that 30 minutes. So it may be that they need to physically get ready. It may be that they need to tactically get ready. It may be that they technically need to get ready. There are a wide variety of sort of options available for them for that 30-minute window. But the expectation is that they will be ready to train when the whistle goes to warm up. So you have to have both, don't you? You have to have that kind of accountability, responsibility, and expectation on the playing group. You have to have it on me in terms of framing out that 30 minutes appropriately, and that has to be aided with good objective data.
Your role as the head S&C for Ireland, and now you're preparing to go down under. But players are drawn from provinces, and not just the provinces, but from other teams as well, outside of even Ireland. It's a challenging role that you have, because they're obviously, it's the same time of the year, but they've been under different programs and that. How do you manage the coordination and the syncing together of players that are coming from different backgrounds, environments and approaches?
We do, it's a challenge, but it's a really good challenge. Thankfully, there's only 4 teams, or maybe, as you said, it might be in exile 1 or 2 from somewhere else. But we talked about relationships a few minutes ago. I've worked in what I consider to be incredibly hard to build positive relationships with the lead S&C coaches around the provinces. They're incredibly good S&C coaches. And what I do is I ensure that there is really good clear lines of communication with them in terms of the programming that a player is doing prior to camp. There is good communication in terms of the programming that we have put in place for our camp periods. We share that data, we share that information. We go back and forward. We change some exercises based on contraindications. We engage with some of the players so that they're informed as to how they're going to transition from one environment to the next. And all that planning goes into play, hopefully to make that transition into our environment a little bit more seamless. As you would know, when you're designing a program, there's a couple of things. One, exercise prescription can be quite easy to manage, because a lot of players are doing some form of squatting, and a lot of players will do some form of squatting in our environment. We all understand posterior chain is exposure is appropriate, and so there's a lot of continuity anyway. But when I write a program, who I am is wrapped up in that program. And when an S&C coach around the province, who he is and who his team are, by way of coaches, it's wrapped up in their programming too. So we have to acknowledge that there's a sort of individualness to people's programming. And that's the hump that we need to get over at times. I need to be able to say, yes, this is what I would like to do, but this is currently what the player is doing. And if we shift too much from that, there is a potential stress there.
Okay, the challenge now is today, Leinster play the Scarlets, but you're hoping that all those players come through well, safe, injured free, and you're preparing to go down under, where you're going three test series with Australia.
Yeah.
Your weekly, if it is, it's at the end of a season, a long season. What are your priorities in what you do, preparing for that three test series, and then when you're down there, what are your priorities?
Well, you're right. If we can get as clean a bill of health as possible, and that's our first win. And sometimes that's in the lap of the gods, but I think also part of that has been a well-managed program of work for the player right the way through the season. So they're coming to this point in time, not talking about fatigue, not talking about the fact that it's a long season, but they're coming to the end of their season provincially, and to a tour hopefully in good form, in good spirits, full of energy and full of enthusiasm for the tour. That's the first thing. So we've managed hopefully each of these players quite well through the season. We've been working hard behind the scenes with our nutritionist and our doctor and our medical support to get a sort of a jet lag sleep strategy in place, because that's obviously going to be an issue for us. We've got a 9-hour time difference, and we arrive 7 days out from a first test match. So we are looking at ways in which we can try and accelerate that circadian advance, which isn't easy, because there's a sort of a natural kind of rhythm of adjustment that we can't beat. But we're working hard to try and do that as part of a sleep jet lag strategy. That would be our first protocol. We're obviously looking to strategize how we can best travel in transit. And then we've spoken at length with the coaches in terms of programming how much work we do in the early part of the first week, such that we are working with intensity at the required level, absolutely at times, but we are also absolutely engaged in recovery processes for the first 3, 4, 5 days before we take Australia on in Brisbane.
So the challenge is not only on the playing pitch, but on the preparation. I think that's a great way maybe to start winding up, Joe, to hear that behind the scenes there is so much going on, and it's combinations of different experts liaising, working together. Your role is one of several. Your role is one of several roles. You've got an analyst. Could you just outline for us the composition of the support staff that's going down under with? Is it 35? Is it 35?
32 or 3 players, I think.
33 players.
Yeah.
So just outline that, just to give us a sense of the mission that's ahead.
Yeah, I think we've 19 staff. We've 19 staff. We've obviously got the coaching group, 4 or 5 rugby coaches. You've got your media crew as well. You have 2 massage therapists, 2 physiotherapists, doctor. You have myself as a strength and conditioning coach, GPS analyst. You have our nutritionist, and then we've got an unbelievable operations team who are basically trying to meet the needs of all of those backroom staff and put it all together and make it work in one package. So 19 staff trying to cater for between 30 to 35 players. So it's the support that the playing group get is phenomenal. The interaction that each of those backroom staff have with each other is really fantastic at the moment, working really well. And there's no question but that the support that they give the playing group contributes massively to their ability to perform on a Saturday, for sure.
Okay, we'll just jump a little bit before we wind up. it doesn't end there, because you got to get back. And then what is ahead for you? Because, okay, there's a World Cup year coming up, hot on the heels of this.
Yeah.
So briefly, very, very quickly, what does it look like for you once you start, when you come back?
When we come back, we'll have a little break, obviously. But yeah, I think from that point, there's a couple of things. One, the focus is always next game with the coaching group. It's a next game focus, and we don't want to drift too far from the November series, which is coming up, the subsequent Six Nations, and then the World Cup. But everybody has one eye on the World Cup. I guess we feel we need to atone for our sins somewhat, in the sense that the quarterfinal last year didn't meet our expectations, and we want to do better than that this time round. So yes, our preparations and our next game focus probably does have, a 10-15% eye on what it is that we're going to do, hopefully for the World Cup a little bit better this time round. So again, the sleep strategy document that we're trying to put together, that's going to have an implication for Japan. We play Scotland first up. We need to make sure that we're ready to play that game. We're looking, obviously, trying to expose players to minutes at test match level. We're looking to make sure that we have players who are resilient and robust. We would definitely be looking at, the duration and the type of quality of work that these players need for their pre-season this summer, and the pre-season obviously coming into the World Cup. So it's occupying our minds, absolutely, yeah. And we are all very much determined, as I said, to go at least one step, if not two steps better than the last time round.
Jason, it's great having you here. Earlier on, I mentioned, and I'm going to we'll perhaps wind up with this. You're an elite band of coaches who have been working for years in that one environment. Yourself, Dave Fagan and Fergal O'Callaghan, chair 20 years each.
Aidan O'Connell there as well.
Aidan O'Connell.
Johnny Davis up in Ulster.
Johnny Davis. You've got your expats as well, who have drifted abroad.
Yeah.
And you have several other coaches that support you continuously. It's a great system of support that you have, but we're just delighted that you've shared with us some of your principles which relate to relationships, the core element of relationships. So from an S&C coach, from a performance scientist, from a trainer, whatever, even outside of sport, and I think this is very important, that network, that support is critical, I would imagine, because what you've been describing it's a support system that you operate within.
Yeah.
So if somebody is not within the world of sport, they're in the exercise, they're in the physical training, they're in the recreational exercise, it's probably the same principles that are operating as well.
Absolutely, yeah, agree, absolutely. I mean, for me, the synergy of a group that is functioning well, as opposed to a group that's functioning poorly, is just it's fundamental to success, And if you think about rugby, it's and the game, it's chaos. It's a chaotic event, and it's the complex systems theory, let's call it, but it's a chaotic event, and really all we're trying to do, without knowing the winning formula, we're simply just trying to stack the odds in our favour, so that we can potentially come out on the right side of a win or the game at the weekend. And in order to be able to stack the odds in your favour, you have to be working as one, with one view, and hopefully to get to one outcome. Okay, well listen, Joe, thank you very much. We're going to leave that, and we wish you the very best on what's coming. And as always, your work is quiet, it's unassuming behind the scenes. You've been the one constant over a 20-year progression of one of the best rugby playing teams in the world. So we're just delighted, and thank you very much for being with us. Thanks, Liam, no problem. Thanks, great to talk to you.